Good morning, everybody. Good to have you here. Thank you so much for coming. I believe that this is going to be an interesting journey today as we consider the ancestor syndrome and all of that associated with this fascinating idea. I guess if I was to think about ways of developing this idea of ancestor syndrome, I would use phrases like invisible loyalties. Why we have loyalties to our family, to people who have been significant in our lives, what we bury in our crypts, and what the phantoms are that we experience in our lives. That's what we're talking about when it comes to ancestor syndrome. But I want us to spend a little bit of time today just going back to what we said right in the beginning here about the developmental stages that lead individuals and children towards adulthood, that begins in the early years with bonding between the mother, primarily as the primary caregiver, but also in other ways to the father. The father serves a very important role in terms of helping a child to achieve independence. And of course, if there is no father, then sometimes a near peer father, so to speak, somebody, a male personality, can fulfill the same role. So that bonding obviously is a very important stage where a child learns to trust life because he or she trusts his mother. And then as he progresses and grows, he works towards separation. He's always looking over his shoulder when he moves a little bit of distance away from his mother. But he's working towards a new kind of experience in his life. And this separation leads to to counter dependency. He was fully dependent on his mother in the first 6 to 9 months. But 18 to 36 months is a partial separation, and counter dependency becomes a part of his life. And then as he goes on, this grows, his sense of identity, his understanding of who he is begins to develop, and slowly but surely he is establishing his autonomous sense of self, which is absolutely vital. And then going on as he grows into youth, certainly between the ages of 6 and 12, he's balancing oneness and separateness. He's wanting to be a part of his family, but he's also wanting to have his own unique identity. So he's moving towards separateness. So the whole process is from dependency, counter-dependency, independence, and then, if all has gone well, to interdependence. And that really, I think, is what we are all aiming at in our lives. Now, welcome those who have come. Thank you so much that you've taken the time and you're with us this morning. I do hope it's going to be valuable. Please raise your issues and your questions. Certainly just list what you are thinking about this area as well, because that's always helpful to get other points of view. Last week, we spoke about cross-cultural competence, how if we're going to become assertive individuals, if we're going to move out of a very isolated kind of existence where we don't interact very well with others, or we become very compliant, it's really difficult to really perceive what we really think. We don't give out much because we're always trying to please everybody around us. This compliance can become a problem for people. And certainly those who are struggling with unwanted same-sex attraction, because they've had to hide, because there's a very high level of shame in their lives, this often becomes a factor. And they find themselves compliant in their relationships in the home, and as students or scholars, it's the same thing. And they are so afraid often in their social interactions that it's the same thing. They kind of hide and don't let anybody know what's going on. Now, it's easy to stereotype and think that everybody is like that. That wouldn't be the truth. Many are not. Some are very outgoing. Some are kind of hyper on the scale. And we need to address that perhaps at another time. But when we were talking about cross-cultural competence, you may remember that I made reference to what we call generally as the Johari Window. And this is the point that I was trying to make, that we indeed are very complex organisms. We show ourselves in the public domain as I am now, and I am conveying something that I am wanting you to know about me. You could say that. And you look at me and you identify or disidentify with certain things about me. But then there's also my private self that is only known to me. And that's all in the conscious domain. But there's also an unconscious domain within my sense of being where part of myself is hidden from myself, but it's known to others. So I'm known to others, but I'm not known to me. In other words, you know more than I do on that level, because you see things objectively. You have comparisons to make. You have an experience of life that kind of can slot me in somewhere. And then finally, there's an area of me that is not even known well to myself, and it's not known to you. It's hidden, and that is the most unconscious part of me. Now, why is this relevant? Well, what I'm arguing is it's a good thing for us to strive to know ourselves. The more we know ourselves, the more we have compassion on who we are, the better I think we are able to interact in the world and to achieve the cross-cultural communication that surely is a very good thing to be aiming at. So I find the Johari window very important. But I want to now take that a step further, so to speak, and make things a little bit more practical. So allow me to share something personal with you, if you wouldn't mind. So a good friend of mine decided that I needed to know more about my heritage. I think it was because he'd undertaken the test, and I was fascinated with what the tests had brought up. So he encouraged me to get the test done, and I did. And just by the way, there's loads of specials. They haven't paid me to say this, but on my heritage, I think you get a really good discount at the moment. So it's not too bad in terms of getting the test. Of course, there's all sorts of issues about whether you want your DNA in some database. That's another story, but I thought, well, at my age, I'm not too worried about that. But you can see, hopefully, in this, what the results were. You get a stunning little video that plays music associated with the countries that you come from. And lo and behold, 66% of me is Irish, Scottish, or Welsh, and only 19.8% English. And I'm really thrilled to say, a smattering of Greek and South Italian in me. That's really important because I love those areas of the world. And a lot of my study was around Greek architecture, and of course, ancient history was one of my majors. And I just love that period of history. And of course, I'm an insatiable armchair archaeologist. All of those things really fascinate me. But this is interesting to me because it kind of confirms some things about my life. So if you'd forgive me, I wanted to share with you actually a book that I put together a while ago. Let me just remove that map. And I'm introducing you to Alice Terry, who was in the First World War, in Ypres, I think it is. I think that's how you pronounce it in Belgium. And that's where she married, or she met, and they later married my grandfather, Ralph Grimshaw. And there she is again, this lady. And there's their family. One of those would be my mother, I think, the little one with the man there, Ralph, and Alice is holding Anthony, her brother. I really enjoy looking at my ancestry. You can see my grandmother, my mother's mother, and you can see, I'm sure, you'll have things pretty similar in your own family in terms of where you've come from. There's my mother who, after the war, emigrated to Ndola, what is now Zambia. That's my mother's brother at the bottom page. He comes from a long line of people who like to do hunting. There's my mother as a nurse. There's a kind of rich heritage here, I would say. And then, it goes on, my book. This book was just done kind of to celebrate my mum and dad. They've both passed away. Here's my dad. This is him at Alamein during the war. I don't know who this is, one of his mates, I guess. He was given the military medal, and I get to keep the citation and the medal. I think I have it. But this is what I want to show you. Now, my grandfather got the OBE. And so here he is, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Grimshaw, and he was invited to the palace on June 1953, and he got the OBE. He was in the British Legion, and he did all this work for charity, and he did a good job. So that, plus the fact that, well, sometimes I get emails from people who say, why don't you just go where you came from? Please leave. Have you thought of getting a job in a different country? So I'm taking comfort today in the fact that actually I belong where I am. And my move to Ireland was not misplaced. My granny is from County Cork. So I have an Irish granny like the rest of the world. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm indulging in all of this information about myself. What I'm encouraging you to do, folks, is to look closely at your story. Spend some time with the photographs that remain from previous generations and have a look at what this has given to you. And there may be a full range of emotions, full range of emotions when you look at those photographs. It may bring regret, it may bring sadness, it may make you angry, it may make you proud when I see my grandfather doing so well in society. But of course, there's a lot to that story that I'm not necessarily sharing here, although I might a little bit later, so that I can demonstrate what I'm talking about when I speak of the ancestor syndrome. Okay, now it's going to get more practical, so give me a chance. It's great to see those of you who've come, Petro and Matthew and Kylie, Mike. It's very good to have you again. Thank you for coming. Now, I just want to shift gears a bit before we continue with the ancestor syndrome, and I wanted to pay attention to this man, Mr. Wesley. You'll remember that he went to convert the Indians, and he spent a bit of time there, but his commentary was, I went to convert them, but who will convert me? And you'll remember the story on the ship back to England. He saw the Moravians, a group of evangelical German Christians who were also on board the ship. And they exhibited peace and tranquility, and I guess all the fruits of the Spirit. And John Wesley was full of fear and turmoil during a storm. And these people rarely witnessed the presence of Christ. And so it began that with Peter Böhler, who I think was their leader, there was a very good relationship built up with him. And in time, indeed, once back in Aldersgate, I think it is, in England, when Wesley had returned there, he experienced a conversion experience and, of course, an infilling of the Holy Spirit in a way that was remarkable. Now, the thing about Wesley that interests me is the fact that he always said he was man of one book, homo libris uni. And of course, that's an interesting phrase. It makes us think, well, he just read the Bible. What he was saying is, of course, by comparison, the Bible is the most important book a man can ever read and spend time with. And hopefully you know the story that much of his time was spent traveling on horseback across England and Ireland, preaching and teaching, and much of his time whilst he was traveling was spent reading. I don't know how you read and, but that's what he did. And he was a prolific writer. In fact, if you look above my head to the right, you can see a man's face. So those volumes are all Wesley's works on that shelf there. They're really important to me. They describe the revival in England and some of the remarkable things that happened and the transformation that began to take place across England because of God's work through people like Wesley and, of course, Whitefield. They were poles apart theologically, but they seem to walk in a relationship to God that was remarkable. Now, here's the thing. Wesley, man of one book, wrote also or put together a compendium of what he felt were, the most important writings up to his time. So I think there were 50 volumes originally, and you can find these at the Wesley Center online if you would just search for it, because I see I've cut the URL out. It's coming from Northwest Nazarene University. And what they've done is digitized his full library there. So, this is what really fascinates me. This is a man full of the Spirit of God, who did, by his grace, remarkable things that impacted and affected the social fabric of society in the day. I mean, the pubs closed, the drunkenness went down, people became motivated in terms of showing love and respect. This is the fruit of genuine and true revival, this man of one book. But the point is, he was very well read. He truly learned how, to eat the meat and leave the bones. He was informed. He understood politics of the day. He was into his primitive physics. He was busy trying to find cures for different diseases. And he wrote a book called The Primitive Physic. There are so many areas of life that Wesley was engaged in. Now, he didn't have a very successful marriage, I have to say. We're told that his wife felt as though she was tied to the tail of a comet. And there were some real issues. So we're not talking about some perfect individual. We're talking about a man who was engaged with life. He certainly did learn how to communicate ultimately across cultures. He spoke in a way that drew men to what he was lifting up, to the gospel of Christ, basically. And for me, he's a hero. Not very far from here, where I'm living in Northern Ireland, in the town of Lisbon, there's a building that still remembers the fact that Wesley visited here, spent time here, and did quite a bit of preaching. Okay, so there's an enormous heritage there that came from that time. But what I'm wanting to highlight is the fact that this was not a cloistered man. This is a man who got his hands dirty, whose mind was engaged, a man who was able to relate to the poor and to the humble in a very dramatic way. This is a man who I would say was well integrated in terms of what was happening in his life. Hopefully you'll see more relevance in what I'm saying as we go on. So let's just progress a bit with what we're talking about here. And I want to just make reference to this book. There always has to be a health warning with any book, because this whole idea of being influenced by people in the past can have can go in peculiar directions. Some people worship their ancestors. I'm not talking about that. Some people try and contact their ancestors. I am definitely not talking about that. What I am talking about is the fact that there is such a thing in life called cross-generational trauma that goes from one generation to the next. There is a transference that takes place that we don't necessarily need to recognize, or we don't recognize because it's not spoken about. But somehow, through these unspoken loyalties that we seem to have embedded in our lives, it is as though there is a connection between ourselves and the way we act and the way we perform in life and what happened in the past. And I would say for Christian people, we do need to be very aware, or as aware as we can be, or we need to allow God through his Holy Spirit to tell us about things that we need to be aware of that have come into our lives. So do raise your issues or concerns with what I am saying here if you have something to say. But right now, I would like to ask you this question. What is the lowest or the simplest form of humanity? What would your answer be? I'm going to wait 2 seconds to see if anybody is out there who would be willing to tell me. What do you think the simplest form of human existence is? That might be a difficult question to answer, but think about it for a minute. What would you say? Well, you've all headed out. It looks like you've left. I've left you. You're not following what I'm saying, so you've gone. I'm not seeing anybody respond. Come on, guys. What do you believe is the simplest form of humanity? What does it look like? What words would you use? Okay, well, most people would say it's the individual, a man or a woman. That, you can't have less than one man or one woman. Okay, you get where I'm coming from. What's the simplest form of the human being? The lowest common denominator is sin itself, in my view, if that's what you mean. And so says Sam. Well, I certainly agree with that, Sam. Ferguson, what are you saying? Life in the garden without thorns. Well, you're all in spiritual mode. Karis, being a newborn baby. I think that's really helpful. There's no wrong answers here. Karis is going for, like a newborn baby today. But this is the point that I'm trying to make. I would say, or I didn't say it, obviously others have said it, and I'm agreeing with them, that really the simplest part of a human being, the simplest element of a human being is what we call a social atom, if you get my meaning. So there's me, but if you look at the diagram that we call a social atom there, you can see that I am, in a sense, made up of, obviously, my mother and my father. I do have friends. I have a relationship to the work that I do. I have a relationship to my local community. I have grandparents who I've briefly introduced you today, Alice and Ralph. I have a sister. I have a brother-in-law. I could go on unpacking my family here pretty well. And I think that what I would come up with is a very detailed picture of who I am. Do you get what I'm trying to say here? That no man is a desert island. Even if you're alone, I would argue, Ferguson, on an island, all on your own, you're still the composite of everything that went before you. There'll have been a contribution from your mother, from your father. You would have had siblings. You would have had peers if you went to school before you got marooned on that island. And okay, maybe you were an orphan and you never met your parents, yet there is still an investment in you. For me, it was really interesting to get my DNA done because it also connected me, in a sense, with the rest of the world. It can be, all of us can experience loneliness in our lives when we don't really understand where we fit. So here, folks, I'm trying to get into a more practical way of understanding who we are. And what I want to suggest to you is by exploring your social atom, you will be able to get a better picture of who you are. Now, what you're seeing in this diagram is a very superficial kind of illustration that is depicting an individual, okay? And you may have a diagram that looks completely different. You might start in the left corner at the bottom, and you might trace things in a completely different way. There's different ways of drawing this diagram, but it's an important start to understanding who you are. And as we go on, hopefully this will become clear. It's a good tool, and it's a tool that would be used by group psychotherapists and counselors when they want to explore your history. But what I'm suggesting is you can do this on your own. You can begin to see how you relate to other things and to other people in your life. And once you've marked it all down, then because of the tools I'm going to share with you in a few minutes, you might be able to go yet a bit deeper and understand some of the impact that all this is having, and why this history is important to you. So one important tool in exploring who we are is to recognize that we are a product of much else in our lives, especially when we've crossed language groups, or when we've emigrated and we've come into a new situation. All of these contexts are probably going to help us to need to understand who we are. So the social atom is one way that I would say that you might be able to explore things. Then if you are fortunate enough to get into a group psychotherapy context, now that's where I trained, and of course some of you will know my history, because I hold the view that people should be allowed to move away from unwanted same-sex attractions and gender confusions if that is their desire, and they should be supported by professionals in that process if that's the route that they seek to go. I was removed from the British Psychodrama Association, which at the time was led very much by the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy. And there's a long history to that, but that's not what we're focusing on today. But my interest very much is in group psychotherapy, or counseling in a group context. Let's put it that way. I don't call myself a psychodrama psychotherapist, because I was not allowed to finish my work. There was no complaint about me. It's just simply that my ideas don't fit with what the UKCP is demanding and requiring in terms of professional viewpoints that have to be held. I'm not into this control thing. I think we need to be able to think freely. I think we need to have diversity in how we approach things. And I think as iron strikes iron, we should be able to get to the science that is factual and can be demonstrated empirically and repeated, because that's the model that I think that makes the most difference. It's really interesting for me in the UK at the moment that the government talks very much about being led by the science, but this doesn't seem to be transferred to being led by the science when it comes to issues around sexuality, although of course there will be those who will disagree with what I'm saying there. So, sorry, back to what we're talking about. Sociometry is a really important skill that anybody in a group might learn from. Now, these are not necessarily skills that you can just pick up and apply, but certainly they can be demonstrated and they can be shown to be very, very useful. And I like to do that in the groups that I run, because it it exposes something about the undercurrents, the things that happen in groups that we're not conscious of. You know how it is when you go into a room and there's a group of people. This individual you're going to avoid, and this group of people over here, well, you're quite attracted to them and you move in that direction. And the processes that dictate that very often will be unconscious. You won't know why you do it, you just do it. It just feels natural. That's what I'm talking about. It can be really useful to begin to understand the dynamics that are functioning in the group that make us as individuals react to that group. So what is sociometry? Sociometry, I think I spelled that right. Yes, it comes from the Latin word socius, which means companion, and metrum, which means to measure. So it's a measurement of how people relate to one another. Sociometry is the inquiry into the evolution and organization of groups and the position of individuals within them. And in psychodrama, because it's really the first and original group psychotherapy method, it was very much about unpacking I guess the strength of the group. J.L. Moreno was interested in using groups to support his clients who were needing help. Excuse me. Got a bottle of water here. Maybe that will help. Have a quick look at the screen while I take a drink, if you would. So I'm just going to read the sociometry. Provides the opportunity to present simply and graphically the entire structure of relationships at any point in time for any given group. So just to explain very quickly, there are techniques that people who are skilled in this area can use. They will, in psychodrama, it's never theoretical. It's always about action and activity. And whereas Freud laid people down on a couch and said, tell me your story, Moreno didn't need a couch. He could be anywhere, basically. And he would say to his clients, show me. And then through guided facilitation, he would help them to articulate the issue that they were facing. And he developed his work actually by looking at children play in Vienna. I think Freud and Moreno were basically contemporary, and they did meet. It's all a very interesting history. And just by the way, Moreno is not my theological hero. I've introduced you to my theological hero. That would definitely be people like John Wesley. And J.L. Moreno had a very challenged view when it came to spirituality. Let me put it this way. But the good contribution I feel that he made was in developing group psychotherapy and creating contexts where people could find healing. And why do I say that? Well, if you go back into the history, you will find that psychodrama groups were quite ubiquitous in hospitals, certainly in the US, in many cities. It's probably more in decline now, but that's because it's a kind of expensive technique that takes a lot of time. A psychodrama group can, be up to 80 minutes, maybe, well, certainly 2 hours. So it's a major investment and a lot of people working together, but it's a really good approach, by the way. So the term sociometry was coined by J.L. Moreno. And the point is, it measures attractions and repulsions. Now, I'm just saying that being in a group and And if you are blessed with a well-informed and well-trained facilitator in a group who is able to pay attention to what is happening, you know, underground, so to speak. And if it's a group that focuses on helping individuals achieve their potential, this can be very healing, especially for those who struggle with unwanted same-sex attractions. Remember, they have sometimes been wounded in society. They have been mocked and bullied. They've been forced to be inauthentic, to become overly compliant, whatever it is. And because they've never been able to process that, they've just swallowed it all the time. They've become more and more distant from life until they retreat. And the only solace that they have is by looking for connection and identity with other people around them. And so they somehow the attraction becomes sexualized, and what they miss in terms of the deficits that they experience as men, if we're talking about men, they will look for completion by getting with other men. And because they've become confused over sexuality, they think it's about sexual connection when actually it's about emotional connection. That's what's missing. And once that emotional connection is rediscovered, very often for people who want it, the sexual attraction dissipates and in some cases is removed. So in a sociometry context, in group work, in good group work, we are looking at the intragroup relationships, the relationships between individuals in a group. So one more tool that I just want to share with you, and then I will bring this to a conclusion and make a bit of a summary, has to do with how we develop the social atom. So if you're vaguely interested in doing this work yourself, get an A5 piece of paper, that's two A4 pieces, join them together so that you've got a big canvas, so to speak, and then I suggest you start building your social atom. So you can start with a circle that represents a female. These are the kind of notional or notational symbols that are used characteristically in an atom. There's a triangle for the male. You can see that anything that is genderless, representing an institution or your career, because I mean, why not draw a book to represent your studies, or whatever you are, you can represent it there, make it into a square so everybody knows, or whoever you share this with, you put a little key at the bottom, make sure that those things are genderless. Maybe different cultures have a different view about that, but that's another story. You also want to indicate who is deceased and whether they are deceased males or deceased females. But then here's the trick. If you notice in this diagram, there are different lines to represent the strength of connection. So mutual attraction is represented by a solid dark line. Mutual rejection is represented in the way that you see there at the bottom by dashes, so to speak. And mutual indifference, I don't really care one way or the other, is shown by dots. Now, you don't have to stick to these conventions, but if you want to be consistent with what others have found works, you could use those notations, but you can invent your own symbols. You can have your own structure, but can you see that this can be a really useful tool for you to begin to map out your life, and what of those who came before you, your parents, as far back as you can go, um, because as you reflect on this and as you work with it and as you begin to unpack why things happen in your life, why hold to certain loyalties, where your sense of direction and purpose and meaning come from, who has influenced you. Now, why am I saying all of this? Because we are talking about becoming assertive people, and I've suggested, and of course others have long before me, that in the assertive state, that's the safest place to be, because that's when you are the real you. That's when you are on the offensive instead of, retreating and being indecisive and not really understanding where you fit, not understanding what your goals are in life, not understanding your unique potential and contribution to life is. That's why we do this work. It's about knowing yourself. And if you know yourself, I would argue you're going in the right direction to becoming more authentic, more free to express your values. And then, who knows, maybe one day, you'll be like my grandpa. You'll get the OBE, and you'll get recognition. Of course, ultimately, you want the creator of your soul to say, well done, good and faithful servant. But there's nothing wrong with you becoming a force in society. Look at what Wilberforce did. Look at the pain and the struggle. Friends, get that movie. I think it's called Amazing Grace. Or watch the film about Bonhoeffer. I've just forgotten the title. They're all available easily, and I know the Bonhoeffer film is available online for free. I just can't remember the title. Does anybody know what it is? Louis, it's so good to see you. Thank you for coming all the way from the USA. It's lovely to have you folks. Well, I've rattled on. We were a bit late starting today, so I want to honor the time. I've just maybe, in very broad strokes, tried to paint where we might want to go in terms of understanding how we connect or how we disconnect from our society. And the goal is that we should become more and more authentic in the way that we live our lives, the way God intended us to live. So I'm not really seeing any questions here. Oh, Mike, you are saying individuals in isolation without ancestors if they don't exist. I wish you were here. We could have a conversation with that. Isolation, I am arguing, is truly an issue in our lives, and we need to be able to understand it. Mike is saying this is a big subject. It could go on for a long time. It should. I've probably just opened the lid. We need to come back to it. And we need to be careful how we explore this. We need to be safe in the places that we do it. You just don't open your life to anyone. That's why we have professionals who are there to help us, and but also godly counselors and pastoral carers who share your values and share your desire to live in a way that is pleasing to God. Those are the people to connect with. So thank you very much for coming today, and God bless you, each one. I just should show us in closing what's coming up next week. We're now heading towards episode 8, The Replacement Child. I think there's a blessing there. Mike is asking the $64,000 question right at the end of the session here. Why do we do things that are characteristic of our ancestors, even if we don't know anything about them? Well, that's what I am trying to begin to explore, Mike. Exactly that. How are these values transmitted? You know, it's almost as though there's been an osmosis that we have been subjected to, I would say, as children. And values and attitudes and perspectives come into us from those who have nurtured us. And these may be, you know, for good, but they can also be damaging. But the point is, we need to be able to understand them. We need to be able to get to the point where we take charge of our own lives, where we, you know, are grateful for the good things, but we reject the bad things, and we go towards the future that we have, because you know, we're on this planet for a reason. There's a purpose. So next week we'll start talking about the replacement child. This is another, you know, inauthentic way of being in life that disempowers individuals, and certainly can make a person fail to achieve what they should be achieving in life, because they are locked into something that they were given that doesn't belong to them rightfully. So that's what I want to look at. Then we're going still towards doing a bit on trauma, and then we'll finish by looking more closely at these strategies and trying to see what we've learned together. So thank you very much. I'm going to pray. God bless you. Thank you for coming and for the time that you have given to this today. I'd love to hear more about your thinking, what you're doing. Please do write to me. Set me right where I need to be given a different perspective. That would also be really helpful, and I'll do my best as we continue to explore these sessions properly. Can we pray in closing? Father in heaven, we thank you for your goodness, that you have given us life and breath and potential and hope, that, Lord, you do not hold the past against us. You set us free. And that's what we long for more than ever, to be free from anything that pushes us in directions that we don't want to go in. Would you put your hand upon us now, cleanse us by your presence, and keep us safe? We ask it all in Jesus' name and for his sake. Amen. Goodbye, folks. God bless.